Hello everyone, this is the presentation over incorporating quotations, including using signal phrases and MLA in-text citations to properly incorporate your quotations. This presentation is meant to substitute for the in-class presentation over the same topics. So if you have attended in class this week, this is the same thing. So first, let's review the 3 ways to use sources in your writing, and a reminder that you must cite all of them. So we've already gone over summarizing and paraphrasing. Today's presentation is focusing on quotations, and it's really important to get quoting correctly. But first, a reminder that regardless of the ways in which you use the source, whether you're summarizing or paraphrasing in your own words, or using a word-for-word quotation from a source, you have to cite all of them because all of these mean you're using ideas or information from another source, not from your own brain. So don't forget to cite. To go over the reasons why we quote and the different circumstances in which we use quoting, summarizing, and paraphrasing, I'm going to use this sports metaphor for you. So I'm going to take you to this article recapping the Jaguars versus Patriots championship in 2018. It was a very exciting game. And really the overall, the article uses quoting, summarizing, and paraphrasing in very distinct ways that can help you understand the difference and when it's appropriate to use which kind. So overall, we begin with, this is sort of a one-sentence summary, right? Tom Brady and the Patriots are headed back to the Super Bowl for the 8th time. And then this is also sort of a longer summary. So we've talked about the differences between short and long summaries, and this explains overall what happens. So we begin with summary, right? And anytime you're pulling in something like a quote or a paraphrase, as we talked about in class, you want to begin with summary. This gives the readers of this article context. We understand the overall game before we get to the details, and that's what your writing should do as well. Here later we have sort of paraphrasing. So here we have just specific moments or specific details, specific ideas from the game that are put in the writer's own words. And we paraphrase them because they're important. And so they're, like each one is about a sentence long for the paraphrase. Important ideas from the game. Then we also have quotations. So here we have word for word. In this case, we have a video reproduction of a few of the most important plays. But notice each of these also has context. So you don't just have on this like several different clips without any context, and that's really important for quoting as well. First of all, we only quote or show the moments where you just have to see it. So with quoting, it's the same. You have to see this in its original phrasing. We don't want to overquote. We only want to pull the most important moments from the game or the most important lines from the source that show what we want to show best, right? And then we also always use context around the quotations. So otherwise, okay, but who's ahead at this point? Why is this moment significant? So your commentary as a writer always provides that context and that interpretation of what's going on in this play and why is it important. The same is true in your writing, okay? So we see just a few quotes, 3 or 4 of the key moments. And then here, remember, like before and after, we have sandwiched the quote with introduction and explanation. And you will do the same thing as you're using quotes in your paper. So we only quote sparingly, only when we need to use the author's exact words to convey a particular point. We use the language word for word, and only when it's a quotable quote, and we want to be sure to preserve the original author's phrasing. When we quote, we always put quotation marks around it and we sandwich the quote. And this presentation is going to focus a lot on what that sandwiching means. And of course, we always cite our quotes. So here's this idea of a source sandwich. A quotation can never speak for itself. Your job as the writer is to incorporate that quotation into your own writing using what I call a quote sandwich. So the quote itself is sort of like the meat of the sandwich, right? But before the quote, we introduce the quotation and provide context. We cite the quote afterwards, and then we always explain the quote after we pull it in. So let's talk about first that citation. So we pull in a quotation. Here we have a quotation from an author called Jonathan Gottschall, Rubbery and Easy to Shape. And the basic thing that goes in an MLA in-text citation is the author's last name, a space, and then the page number. Please notice it's not P period and then the page number. It's not PG. It's not the word page. It's just the author's last name, a space, and the page number it came from, okay? So that's important in MLA format particularly, and we are going to be operating in MLA format in this class. Now, if the signal phrase or the same sentence that the quote appears in already includes the author's last name. So here we say Gottschall says, then we do not repeat the author's last name here in the parenthetical citation. This is called a parenthetical citation because it's in parentheses. We also call it an in-text citation because it's in your writing, not at the very end, right? It's text, it's cited within your own text. So if it already includes it, we only use the page number. So only 219 here in the parenthetical citation. Note as well, the punctuation comes after the parenthetical has ended because this is a part of your sentence. The citation is a part of your sentence. You don't want to end the sentence here with a period and then just leave the citation hanging sentenceless. It's a part of your sentence. And so we put the period afterwards, okay? So I want to remind you too that the textbook reading over chapter 14 is very helpful for this because it has citation styles and then it focuses specifically on MLA format here with MLA style and tells you all different types of situations for in-text citations. So it tells you how to do it and it tells you like if the author is already named in the signal phrase, or we can name the author in parentheses. What if there are 2 or 3 or more authors? What if the author is not a specific person, but an organization? What if the author is unknown? What if there is no page number, right? So all of these particular types of examples. Indirect source is another one. If a source has a quote of a quote, right? If they've quoted somebody else within the source, here's what you put in the parenthetical, QTD period. If it's an article without page numbers as well. So all of those examples are here in the textbook. So this is a textbook chapter that should serve as a resource for you if you come across any of these different types of circumstances. So as we move through this presentation, we're going to be working in classroom on quotation integration practice. So you'll want to pause the video here and open that up. When you get to part A, what I would like for you to do here on your sheet is to fill in the parenthetical citation. So you're going to fill in here. You have the page number that it came from. What would you put here? When Gaffigan talks about food, he thinks of himself as one of those sportscasters who used to play professionally. So based on the information we just went over in the presentation, what goes in this parenthetical citation? Please do that for A, B, and C, and then you can come back to the presentation here. So now on to incorporating quotations. The main rule for incorporating quotations is that they should be actually incorporated. We want to avoid what we call a dropped quotation. Here's an example of a dropped quotation. See, as you can see, the sentence ends here, and then we begin a sentence with quotation marks. And we always want to avoid beginning a sentence with quotation marks in a formal essay type of writing. So we call this a dropped quotation because instead of incorporating it into the writer's own sentence, it's just dropped in there. So to avoid a dropped quotation, we have some strategies. But first, going back to that practice sheet, part B here, would you please identify in this paragraph where is the dropped quotation? And you can identify that by highlighting. So, if you thought it was here, you would highlight where you find that dropped quotation. Instead of dropping quotations in, we want to make sure to weave the quote into our own writing. So there are 4 different ways that we can weave quotations or incorporate quotations into our own writing. We can use an according to phrase, according to the author, comma, quote. Here's an example of what that would look like. According to Elmo, comma, quote. Red is a pretty color. Or we can use an author, verb, comma, phrase. So Elmo argued, comma, or you could say Elmo said, Elmo explained, Elmo explored, comma, right? Those different attributive verbs like we talked about with summarizing. You could also say author, verb, that. Elmo says that. Red is a pretty color. And notice if we say that, we don't need a comma here because grammatically it sets up the phrase in a different way. Or you can also embed the phrase into your own paraphrase. So you paraphrase what's going on, and then you just pull a particular phrase from the quote instead of using a sentence as a quotation. It would look like this, embedded into your own sentence. Elmo's main thought about red was that it was a pretty color. So you can sort of, if you were to read that without looking at it, you wouldn't know where the quote began because it sounds embedded. But of course, the quotation marks tell it where it began. So we're going to work through what each of these types of weaving will look like and how to set it up. So these three, the first three there, are examples of using a signal phrase. And here, identified in green, is a signal phrase. Each of these is a signal phrase because they signal that a quote is coming. And they also signal to you who said the quote or where the quote came from. These are also sometimes called phrases of attribution or attributive introductions because they attribute the quote to the person who said it before the quote comes in. So here we have according to Gottschall, comma, quote. And then you'll notice that since the author's name is used here, we have only the page number here. Here we have the author verb, comma, Jonathan Gottschall asserts, comma, quote. Or here we have, it's a paraphrase actually. So this one does not use a quotation, but I want to make sure you know that you use a signal phrase before a paraphrase as well. So you still, even though this is in your own words, you still attribute it to the author and you use a signal phrase verb and you still cite it. Okay, so these are signal phrases. We're going to practice using a signal phrase, but here are some signal verbs, verbs that you can use here. So Jonathan Gottschall argues, Jonathan Gottschall describes, illustrates, suggests, writes, right? You want to choose a verb that makes sense for what's going on in that particular part of the text. So in part B, we have an example of, right, we have identified this dropped quotation in part B. So hopefully in B here, you had identified this as the dropped quotation because here we have Chris agrees, period, and then we just start the quote. We've just dropped it in there. It's not good. So instead, I would like for you to edit this particular dropped quotation to use one of those better examples of using a signal phrase to introduce a quote. Now, when you do that, you want to be really careful not to accidentally use a grammar error to incorporate your quotation. So avoid a run-on or a comma splice. Here's an example of a run-on. Dweck claims mindsets are important. Mindsets lead to different ways of coping with difficulty. This is considered a run-on because it needs punctuation here. It's actually 2 sentences. It's still really a dropped quotation because it's still a sentence and a sentence. It's just missing the period or the comma that would come here. This is a comma splice example. You cannot just put a comma here because this is actually a complete sentence. We never put 2 complete sentences together using only a comma. So you want to instead use one of those signal phrases to fix that one without creating a grammatical error in the middle instead. So see what you can do to edit that, and I'll give you some feedback on whether you've done that smoothly. Again, reminding you that the signal verb chart can help you create that signal phrase that makes the most sense for what's going on in that particular area. Another thing that you can do is incorporate context into the signal phrase. So sometimes a signal phrase is not going to tell us enough, and sometimes we want our readers to know more about the quote. So here's an example of a signal phrase. Bishnoi acknowledges that the learners are challenged, right? So we have a nice signal phrase leading into the quotation. However, this one also provides extra context, extra information in the same signal phrase. We know it's an article and we have the title of the article. That can be really helpful for giving your readers important information about where the quote is coming from. Remember, they need that context first. So looking back at C, part C is asking you to use a basic signal phrase, and then the second part of C is asking you to use a different signal phrase that also incorporates some information. So here we have a quote from Derechowitz, you need to get a job, but you also need to get a life. C1 is asking you to introduce your quote using a basic signal phrase. So you can go back to the examples of what signal phrases look like, the 3 different ways that you can do it. Don't forget the MLA parenthetical citation. So after your quotation, you're going to include those parentheses with the page number the quote came from. Option number 2 is asking you to use a different signal phrase. So if you used according to, you're going to choose a different one. If you use the author plus verb comma, you're going to choose a different one here. And I would like for this one to include context, kind of like this one does, where you have the other information before the signal phrase or as part of the signal phrase leading into the quotation. Finally, option 4 here does not actually use a signal phrase. Instead, it's embedded, and I want to talk about that as well. So this is when you choose a particular phrase from the overall quotation and you weave that phrase into your own paraphrase of the rest of it. So here we go. Elmo's main thought about red was that it was a pretty color. It sounds like your own smooth sentence. Here's another example. We've just taken this one phrase, rubbery and easy to shape. Unlike fiction, reading stories makes us, quote, rubbery and easy to shape. So you see this quote isn't its standalone sentence. And then because we do not have the author as part of the same signal phrase sentence, we put the author space page number it came from. Here's another example. We've just taken the phrase downdraft and incorporated it into a paraphrase. And then because we have Lamont identified right here and then this she that refers back to Lamont, the author is clear. So we can just put the page number here in the parenthetical. But you can see how this is smoothly incorporated into, as just a phrase, into my paraphrase of this section of the reading. She calls the first draft the downdraft because it consists of simply getting words down on a page. This, be really careful in a paraphrase. This is my own words and my own understanding of the text. So provide context and introduce it using a signal phrase. Often you include a summary before the quotation comes in. You cite it using a parenthetical in-text citation, and you're going to use the textbook to help you figure out what goes in there if you have any special cases like 2 authors or no author, right? And then number 3 is to explain and connect the quote. So quotes have to be supported on both sides. You never just put a quote in there and drop it in, and you also never leave it defenseless. Quotes cannot interpret themselves, and your reader is also not responsible for interpreting the sources that you use. Your job as a writer is to interpret the sources for your readers, making sure that they relate to your main claim. So here we have an example. According to Folks' study, we have a little attributive phrase, we have a signal phrase. Dreams may express profound aspects of personality. We have our citation, and then after the citation, you come in and you explain. If so, dreams are essential to human identity. That's an interpretation that you want your readers to get from this quotation. That interpretation is also going to help connect the quote to the point that you are trying to make in the paragraph. Here's another example. We have a quote, according to McKinney's research. Here comes the quotation. This one doesn't have a parenthetical citation. Yours will, but what I want you to notice from this example is the commentary. This shows that yoga can have a positive impact. It's interpreting, explaining the significance of the quotation before you move on. It's your job to link it to the point that you are trying to make. This can also just explain if the quote that you're using is pretty complex. Sometimes you want to come in and explain what the quote means, and then, connect it to the point that you were trying to make. So here's what it will look like to incorporate a quote into your writing. Here we have a summary or some context, right? Before we even get to the quote, we have a whole sentence of summary and context. Then we have a signal phrase, Dweck says that, and a little bit of embedding as well. Then here comes the quote, and we have the citation. In other words comes next. So this is a quote that is a little bit complex. So we have an explanation of what the quote means. And finally, an explanation of the significance of the quote and why it matters. This idea is powerful because ... And then what does Dweck want? Dweck wants us to reflect on this. She wants us to see this. So this is, a couple sentences of explanation of the quote that links it to the point that you, the writer, are trying to make by incorporating the quote in the first place. Notice this is big. And so we don't want just quotes sort of scattered throughout. The quote should really be incorporated into our own arguments. So let's head back to our practice sheet. Part D here is asking you to embed a partial quotation. So you have this quote here for context, and then also we're only going to use the phrase habit of skepticism. So this is going to be a little more tricky. We don't want to quote the entire sentence. Instead, we want to paraphrase what he's talking about here and incorporate and embed just this phrase, habit of skepticism. So you want to go back to the embedding section here. to try to, mimic the same type of structure to embed this quotation into a sentence of your own writing, your own words that sort of gives it some context. Finally, on F, so here's where you're going with it. I want you to choose one key quotation from Gary Gutting's What is College For? Make sure you choose Gary Gutting's What is College For? The online article rather than the first book chapter we started with. So choose just one key quotation and I want you to sandwich it. That means first you're going to provide context. You're going to use a signal phrase or embed it to incorporate it into your own writing. You're going to use a parenthetical citation. And finally, you're going to explain or interpret for at least one sentence afterwards. 1 to a few sentences, I would say, on this. Okay, so that's F. Choose one important quotation and sandwich it. Now, something really important to note about Gutting is it is an online article. It does not have page numbers. And so what do you put in the parenthetical citation, right? We know that the parenthetical citation contains the author's last name and the page number. This does not have page numbers. Some professors will ask you to put the paragraph number in here instead and put like a PAR for paragraph and then the number. I would not like for you to do that on this particular example. So instead, you're just going to use the author's last name in the parenthetical citation. If, though, you use the author's last name here, you actually would not then have anything to put in here. So if you have used the author's last name already, I would like for you to still include a parenthetical citation. So if you do, I would then like for you, in fact, to put PAR period and then the paragraph number that the citation you chose came from. And that does mean that you'll count the paragraphs to determine which paragraph it came from. Okay, so this assignment here is a practice assignment. I want to see that you put your best effort into it. I will give you completion points for it, and then I will leave feedback. So anything that needs attention or needs redirection, I will leave you feedback on so that you can see and learn from that as we begin to incorporate quotes in our own writing. As always, let me know if you have any questions, and good luck on the practice sheet. Bye!